Why are you all here? All right. Good afternoon. As usual, our friend Mr. Varma will brief on behalf of the PGA after we're done here. Today and tomorrow, the Secretary General will be leading the semi-annual meeting of the UN System Chief Executive Boards for Coordination, the CEB, which brings together under his leadership the executive heads of 31 UN system organizations. In keeping with the Secretary General's vision for UN system that is coherent, agile, and strategic, the board is meeting in retreat mode for over 2 days to allow for candid and more forward-looking discussions in 3 distinct areas. Focusing on the state of the world and multilateralism, the CEB members will deliberate on salient trends, emerging opportunities, and challenges in current world affairs and their impact on the UN system. Secondly, they will also discuss frontier issues and challenges emanating from global megatrends and technological advancements in 4 distinct areas: artificial intelligence, cyberspace, biotechnology, and impact of technological applications on peace and security, with a view of identifying specific entry points for UN engagement and to determine focus areas where the UN system can add value. The Secretary General's vision is to bring governments, the private sector, the scientific community, and the international organizations, as well as civil society, together to make sure that the power of science, the power of technology, and the power of innovation are powers for good to make a better world and for the benefit of us all. Finally, the Secretary General will present the board with his proposals for UN reform in the areas of management, peace and security, and the repositioning of the UN development system. Focusing on Yemen, the Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, is scheduled to speak at the Security Council consultations this afternoon on the humanitarian situation in that country. That's at 3 p.m., and he does plan to be available to you at the stakeout afterwards. Meanwhile, we, of course, continue to be extremely worried about the situation in the country, where 7 million people already face possible famine. We can only imagine what will happen if the ports and entry points are not open to both humanitarian and commercial traffic. From Ukraine, the resident coordinator and humanitarian coordinator in that country, Neil Walker, today said he's deeply concerned about the impact of stepped-up clashes in the eastern part of the country near water, electricity, and gas infrastructure as winter begins. He warned that any disruption of essential services could have great consequences for millions of Ukrainians who may need to flee their homes in search of heat and shelter. Mr. Walker reminded all parties to the conflict of their obligation to respect civilian infrastructure and to protect civilians, stressing that any intentional disruption of access to quality water supply or critical heating systems is a clear violation of international humanitarian law. And at the climate conference in Bonn, negotiations have started and have been focusing on the operating manual that will guide the implementation of the Paris Agreement and the way the dialogue will take place at next year's conference in Poland, and that will look at progress. In terms of commitments, the host country, Germany, announced $58 million pledged for the Adaptation Fund, which supports vulnerable communities in developing countries so they can adapt to climate change. The fund aims to mobilize $80 million a year. And wanted to give you an update on the movements of our special envoy for Burundi, Michel Kafando. He did visit Bujumbura last week, where he met with the government officials, the ombudsman, and the archbishops of Bujumbura and Gitega, as well as the diplomatic corps in the country. He discussed the East African community-led inter-Burundi dialogue, the humanitarian socio-economic situation, as well as proposed constitutional amendments recently endorsed by the Council of Ministers. Mr. Kafando also traveled to Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and consulted with the facilitator of the inter-Burundi dialogue, Benjamin Mpaka, on the way forward. And last month, he'd also met in Brussels with exiled opposition leaders. He is expected to be here on November 20th to brief the Security Council. And I wanted to flag an innovative debt swap initiative between the Russian Federation and Mozambique that unlocked a commitment of $40 million. These funds will be used by WFP to support Mozambique to provide school meals for 150,000 children over the next 5 years. The debt swap is the largest in WFP's history. In addition to providing debt relief for Mozambique, it will free up new resources for development and support expansion of the national school feeding program. Despite Mozambique achieving its MDG goal of having the number of hungry people in the country, nearly a quarter of its people face chronic food insecurity and malnourishment. And the Director General of UNESCO, Irena Bokova, today condemned the killing of a media worker during an armed attack on the offices of Shamshad Television in Kabul that took place on Tuesday. Ms. Bokova also extended her sympathy and support for the staff of Shamshad Television, which resumed broadcasting quickly after the attack. And our colleagues at the World Health Organization is recommending that farmers and the food industry stop using antibiotics routinely to promote growth and prevent disease in healthy animals. The new WHO recommendations aim to preserve the effectiveness of antibiotics that are important for human medicine by reducing their unnecessary use in animals. In some countries, approximately 80% of the total consumption of antibiotics is in the animal sector, largely for growth promotion in healthy animals. And the FAO, the Food Agriculture Organization, and the government of Ecuador presented today a new handbook to improve the safety of workers in the banana farming sector. More information on the FAO website. And a note we should have flagged last week, Jan Beagle, the Undersecretary General for Management, visited South Sudan last week in order to hear directly from UN managers and staff serving in the field how headquarters can better support UN field missions and to deliver on their complex mandates in challenging environments. Ms. Beagle engaged directly in dialogue with management and staff at all levels, including town hall gatherings with a focus on field-oriented policies and systems in the context of the Secretary General's reform strategy, which aims for nimbler, more responsive, and accountable organization. As I mentioned, Brendan will brief you after I'm done here, and later this afternoon, after the Council consultations on Somalia, later consultations, Ambassador Cardi will also brief you. Tomorrow, 10:30 in ECOSOC, there will be an event entitled From Desperation to Inspiration, the 70th anniversary of the Anne Frank Diary. The event is co-organized by the DPI and the Anne Frank Center for Mutual Respect and Facing History in Ourselves. That's in New York, in support of the Together initiative. Speakers will include Alison Smale, the Undersecretary General for DPI, Lise Gregoire van Haren, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the Netherlands, and Kimberly Mann, the head of the Education Outreach Section for DPI. Tomorrow, our guests will be Nashad Roshdi, the Deputy Special Representative for the UN mission in the Central African Republic and Humanitarian Coordinator for that country. Also want to flag that we're hoping that the Secretary General will do a stakeout on Friday in the morning outside of the Security Council in advance of his upcoming travels. And today we say thank you to the Syrian Arab Republic, which has paid its regular budget dues in full. Coming, the 140, Joe, you got the question.
All right. Yeah, this morning, the ICC prosecutor, in focusing on Libya, laid out a number of continuing atrocities in Libya. She said the situation was dire. And I'm wondering, given the Secretary General's statement at his press conference here in September that he saw Libya as an area where he thought mediation and preventive diplomacy could work. He was somewhat optimistic about it. Does he still hold to that view?
Yeah, I think the two are not mutually exclusive. I think it is a fact that we have seen the civilian population in Libya continue to suffer. We have seen atrocities. We talk about them regularly from this podium. It is also a fact that there is movement on the political end, and that I think through the increased work of the special representative, we have seen some movement. So I don't see the contradiction in the two. Mr. Bays and then Madame.
Question on Yemen. You've described the humanitarian situation there as catastrophic. What is the UN currently doing? What contacts have there been with Saudi Arabia to try and lift the blockade? And is Saudi Arabia telling you why it's not allowing humanitarian assistance in?
I'm not sure we've got an answer to that question, and that's obviously a question for the Saudis and the coalition led by Saudi Arabia to answer. Yes, we're continuing to have contacts at some of the highest levels and at different levels, but obviously the blockade is continuing. Every day continues, the suffering increases. I think I talked yesterday about the fear of increased prices. We have in country about 91,000 metric tons of food, which is being used to feed the most vulnerable. But as you know, the needs in Yemen are great, and that can only last so long.
You said the highest levels. Has the Secretary General had contacts with
the Secretary
Saudi
General
Arabia?
has also had contacts, and I will leave
with
it
the Foreign Minister?
I will leave it at that. Carol.
Sorry, along the same lines, has the Secretary General perhaps reached out to the Security Council, who will be meeting on this afternoon, to try to get them to weigh in?
Well, I think obviously that will be part of Mr. Lowcock's discussion. He represents the Secretary General, and he will be briefing on the humanitarian situation. I think going into great detail as to what is going on and the risks, the increased risks that the Yemeni people face. Mr. Lee.
Would the Secretary General like to hear the Security Council on this?
I think the Secretary General would like to see those who have influence on the parties use that influence to help us ease the humanitarian situation and lift the blockade. Mr. Lee.
Sure. I have some country-specific things, but I wanted to ask, now that you've announced this Chief Executive Board meeting, it wasn't on his schedule, and maybe there's some, is it entirely internal? Are there any attendees of the CEB meeting who are not UN system officials?
My understanding is that it's solely internal. It's taking place at Green Tree. It's in retreat format.
Sure. I guess I'm just trying to understand, because I also looked this morning at the Deputy Secretary General's schedule, and it said, you know, it said all appointments internal.
She's there as well. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
I mean, it's
Wasn't there
internal. I
some
mean,
meeting? I guess I'm just trying to figure out, like, are we going to get a copy of these reforms? I mean, I heard what you
Well, I mean,
read.
the reforms. I think the Secretary General has been briefing member states in public formats. Has been talking about it in interviews and in press. I mean, so.
There's no
a lot has been shared, and will continue to be shared. Your next question.
Okay, I wanted to ask you. You mentioned now this readout of Mr. Kafando's trip in Burundi, and so I wanted to know, because I've seen articles there in quoting, you know, various mainstream opposition parties saying he didn't meet with them at all, and saying it was sort of. I mean, I'll give you here one of the quotes is disappointed that the UN Special Envoy did not meet the representatives of political parties concerned with the inter-Burundian dialogue.
Well, I mean, I've shared with you what I was
Right.
able to share, and as I said, he did meet with opposition leaders in Belgium. I will come back to you. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Stephane. I was wondering if you have anything on the Turkish Prime Minister's meeting with the Secretary General tomorrow. Any information?
I do not. I will check. I didn't see it on the schedule, but that could be me having read the schedule for tomorrow a little too quickly. But I will come back to you on that. Mr. Avni.
Last week, the UNGA voted on the blockade, on the Cuba blockade. It's an annual vote. Today, the U.S. is announcing new sanctions on Cuba. Does that violate that resolution? Does the UN have anything on that?
No, I'm not. I will not render a legal judgment. Obviously, I think the UN welcomed the opening of diplomatic relations when they occurred between the U.S. and Cuba. But beyond that, I don't have anything to add.
Any information the UN has or doesn't have on that mysterious sonic attack?
We clearly have no information on the sonic thing beyond what I've read in the press. Stefano.
Or the Secretary General has
Sorry.
any opinion on 280 characters on Twitter?
Yeah, I do. Personally, I think we were fine with 140. Stefano.
Thank you.
I mean, giving more words to the UN is always the ability to speak longer is always dangerous. I'm in the 140 camp.
Thank you, Stephane. The situation in Lebanon with the crisis in the government after the resignation of Prime Minister Hariri, is the Secretary General worried that also the circumstances of this resignation coming when he was in Saudi Arabia, somebody is even suspecting that he was not his will of...
Well, I think, you know...
But is the Secretary General worried that what's been happening in Yemen is going to happen in Lebanon?
You know, I'm not going to speculate on what may or may not happen. I think, as the SG says, the more you talk about things that may happen, you increase their chances of happening. So I'll leave the speculation to you. We have expressed our concern about the current political situation in Lebanon, and obviously we're waiting to get a little bit more clarity. Yes.
Thank you, Stephane. Do you have anything to say about the rising tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia?
I think in general terms, we have called for a de-escalation of both actions and rhetoric in the region, and we continue to do that. Majid.
On that, then a question about Iraq. Yesterday, the U.S. accused Iran of supplying Houthi rebels with that missile, that attack on Riyadh, and called for the UN to hold Iran accountable for violating Security Council resolution. Do you have any comments about that? And my second question is about Iraq. We haven't heard any update about the UN reported violations in the town of Tus Hormatu in the province of Kirkuk and in the other areas. There has been only 2 updates by the Humanitarian Office. And obviously, as you know,
we'll try to
things
get,
are going very fast.
No, I understand. We'll try to get some more information out of Iraq on the humanitarian situation. On your first question, I think I tried to answer that yesterday, I think, but that's a question maybe best left to Security Council presidency.
Does the Secretary General think that that Houthi rebels and other rebels in Yemen should not receive more external?
I think what we would like to see is open and unfettered humanitarian access. What we would like to see is serious progress on the political track. Carol.
Stephane, do you have an update on the WFP talks with Myanmar on aid? There was
no, I've not been told that there's been any, there's no progress that I'm able to report. Yes, in the back.
About situation in eastern Ukraine and statement of Neil Walker. What exactly United Nations on this point planning to do with this situation, and on which point now are resolving a possibility of peacekeepers of UN on eastern territories of
well, obviously, you know, on the question of peacekeepers, that's a whole other question. That is one left to the Security Council and the mandate. It's not one that we're discussing. Mr. Walker is focusing on the humanitarian situation, expressing his very real concern about the increased fighting that we've seen, especially fighting that may impact negatively people's access to water, access to heating. We continue through our humanitarian arm to try to deliver aid where we can, but we would like to see the fighting stop to have better access to those people in need. Go ahead.
As the Secretary General will be heading next week to Bonn, what's his expectation from this big conference?
The message will be more commitment, will be accelerated commitments that if things stay as they are, we will not meet the required targets. It's about getting not only national governments, but the business sector and civil society to work together to increase those commitments and to increase action, practical action, to help us reach the necessary targets. Round 2, Mr. Klein and Mr. Lee.
Okay. First of all, you're talking about, just as a follow-up to that, the targets being in terms
of
the
lowering of
the
the
cap
temperature.
on the increase in temperature?
Yeah.
Okay. Is he going to reinforce a message that was delivered in a UN report a week or so ago.
Yeah,
that
definitely.
even
I mean,
if the
he's going
even
to,
if the commitments are
he will be going
met,
to Bonn armed with the knowledge of the report that both the WMO put out, as well as
that even
as
if the
UN.
commitments are met, it's not enough.
Exactly. That's
okay.
That's what I was trying to
my other
express.
question, my actual question, relates to President Trump's statement during his joint news conference in South Korea, urging the North Koreans to come to the table, make a deal, and so forth. He also indicated that there had been some progress in diplomatic movement. So I'm wondering whether you can comment on whether the UN at any level has had any part in that reported diplomatic movement, and also whether the Secretary General would have any overall comment on President Trump's more diplomatic approach to the problem.
Well, obviously, as a matter of course, the UN stands for diplomatic approaches and supports those. I'm not able to share with you any information on whatever diplomatic talks may be taking place.
Is that because you don't know, or you just can't? You're not at liberty
I think
to
it's
say?
exactly what I've said. Mr. Lee.
Sure. I wanted to ask you, there's a very detailed story in Associated Press about torture in Sri Lanka. They've interviewed 50 individuals who are applying for asylum who give detailed accounts of being tortured under the current, not past, government of Sri Lanka, and saying that the military itself was involved. So I'm wondering, one, if there's any reaction given the UN's involvement in the situation in Sri Lanka, but also given that the UN is increasingly using Sri Lankan troops in UN peacekeeping, what do you, when detailed allegations like this come forward, what does the UN do to ensure that the very people who may have been engaged in
there
torture...
is, as a matter of course, there is screening done in partnership with DPKO, DFS, on ensuring that none of the troops that are committed to UN peacekeeping have any human rights abuses, allegations, or issues hanging over their head. So that's a screening process.
But do they self-certify, or given that these are new allegations published today,
I'm
50
sure,
people were interviewed?
I'm sure that my colleagues upstairs are taking these things into account.
And I wanted to ask you on Cameroon, I know that there was a call by Francois Fall and I guess the Secretary General for dialogue with the, quote, Anglophone regions. It's reported in the press in Yaoundé that the government has sought international arrest warrants for 15 Anglophone leaders. And I'm wondering if that would be viewed as consistent with this call for dialogue, and if not, if the UN has anything to say about it.
I don't have any information on those on those arrest warrants. We obviously continue to call for calm and reiterate the availability of the UN to support the search for a lasting solution in the Anglophone provinces, and we call also on the authorities to ensure maximum restraint by security forces. Evelyn. And then Linda.
Yes, I think the Anglophones did some shooting today. What I wanted to ask was, are we going to get a text at all on Yemen from the OCHA representative to the council, or is he only going to talk?
He's speaking in close consultation, so he will brief you afterwards.
But we don't get his
No,
text.
if it's in close consult, you will not. Okay, Linda.
Thank you, Steph. Rick, this is regarding Syria. I was wondering if you could give us an update in terms of whether or not there's been any movements or progress, et cetera, regarding the political track.
None to share, unfortunately. Sir, Mr. Sir, I should, Sir Benny.
Thank you, Lord. By cooperating or co-sponsoring, I don't know exactly what, with the Anne Frank Center, does the UN endorse the more controversial statement that came out of this center that, according to critics, have little to do with its namesake?
That what has to do with this particular center?
That particular.
I don't have deep enough knowledge to answer this question off the top of my head, so I will.
We'll talk later.
We'll talk later. Okay, Mr. Lee.
Sure.
And then we'll go to Mr. Varma.
Okay. 2 investigation questions. One, I would just want to ask you again whether you'll, I guess, confirm or deny that the Secretary General has requested an OIOS inquiry into the circumstances of the leave without pay of Ruslan Okambe.
I'm not
Several
aware.
people on 38 have said. Is it?
All right. The people on 38th floor you talk to don't talk to me. So
I guess what I want to know is,
aware.
as a matter of practice, given that this is the only way that UN staff could know what they can and cannot do.
No, yeah.
I'm
not. If I become aware of things I can share with you, I can share. But I'm just not aware at all of this.
Okay.
Okay.
And the other one has to do with a court-martial in Nigeria. And the reason I'm asking you is that it involves the theft of funds that were meant for the relocation of a UN hospital in MINUSMA. 2 or more senior Nigerian military officials have been accused of, taking $1.4 million that was meant for this MINUSMA hospital. But I'm just wondering, it would seem that the UN would have an interest in this case, given that the hospital was supposed to be.
We'll check with DPKO. Yes, ma'am, and then we'll go to Brendan.
Do you have an update on the number of dead in Syria? What's your last count?
No, I do not. I can check what the last count is. Mr. Varma, you're up.